In this video, I'm going to tell the absolutely amazing story of how Microcosm was solved twice, and I'm going to meet some of the people responsible for the book, as well as the people involved in solving it. It's a longer video than I usually make, but I hope you'll agree it's worth it. Hi, I'm Ben, the lockpicking cuber. Back in April, I made a video about this book, Microcosm. It's an amazing treasure hunt published in 1984, which involved piecing together incredibly obscure clues to figure out a set of themes represented in the verses in the book, and then running the result through a computer program to eventually find a phone number. And the idea was that the first person to phone this phone, shown on the back of the book, and state the name that's written in the envelope shown on the table there, would win £1,000 and a trip on Concorde. And when I made my video 7 months ago, no one had ever solved the puzzle, or honestly even come close to solving it. So here we go, I'm about to meet Bob. I'm very excited, because Bob is the person who wrote this book, which I bought when I was, 16, something like that, and has been part of my life ever since. So here we go.
Hello, Ben. Can you hear me?
We'll meet Bob properly a little bit later, but first let's meet Alex and hear about how he went about solving Microcosm. And trust me, you really want to hear this because it is absolutely extraordinary.
My name is Alex Pavesi. I am an author of crime novels. Here is one. Before writing, I used to work as a software engineer. I worked for Microsoft for almost 5 years. Before that, I did a maths PhD. So I've always been interested in puzzles, and especially ones in book form, especially ones with a kind of literary quality, which Microcosm obviously has. So when I found this book, when I found your original video, it was like it was made for me, to be honest. The combination of computation, some sophisticated maths, and a kind of literary aura of mystery that pervades the whole thing. It's perfect.
Did you go into it thinking, right, this is something where I'm going to actually solve this, or did you just go into it thinking I'll just play around and see where I get to?
No, I didn't think I was going to be able to solve it. I thought the fact that it hadn't been solved by this point kind of almost meant that it would be harder than it was. I had no plan to begin with. I tried to solve it through the intended method of actually working out the themes and putting them in manually. And I spent a few weeks doing that, or a few days probably, but got nowhere. I simultaneously, I didn't think I was going to solve it, but I didn't realize quite how difficult it would be to solve.
But before Alex digs into the detail of how he solved it, I wondered how it felt when he started to get valid answers out of his computer program. He was feeding these lines from the book into his program. Most of the time you get garbage. Suddenly he started to get valid answers. What was that like?
That was amazing. I have to say that was like a magic trick, seeing the secret message come out of the inputs. You get one thing wrong, as you said in your original video. If you get one thing slightly wrong, you just get nonsense. So getting everything just right and then seeing an actual sentence of English, that was phenomenal. So interestingly, because I tried a lot of things, and I had programs that were just running, spitting out sort of false positives, anything that looked like it might be an English sentence. And you'd get strings of nonsense which were made up of these short, strange words. And then some of them would start to look like actual English sentences, and you kind of squint at them and think, maybe that's one of the answers. Is that one of the answers? And I spent a reasonably long time by this point doing that, just looking at nonsense and trying to convince myself whether or not it was potentially English. Even some of them looked like they might plausibly be parts of sentences, because I didn't know each answer would be an actual self-contained thing. I was thinking maybe the answers would spread across multiple messages. Even the answer that was known before, which you mentioned in your last video, so find 13 not me, is what it says. I was wondering, maybe that's just a truncated part of a larger message. Maybe it's find 13 not mentioned, blah 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 blah. And I was worrying about whether my filtering was too strong, because if it was not mentioned and the next message started NTIONED, that would be filtered out. I was wondering about things like proper names, whether they would be filtered out. So I didn't have a huge amount of faith in the process. and I'd read a lot of nonsense and tried to work out whether that was meant to be an answer or not. So then to get one that actually definitely and unambiguously made sense. And the first two messages I got very close together. They were Presidential Road and Jewel from the Earth, both on the same day. And to see those come out and clearly mean something and clearly fit with the themes of the book was amazing. It was just like I'd found some kind of, I don't know, I'd excavated something that had been lost for 40 years.
So how did Alex go about it? I asked him to explain how he approached solving Microcosm.
As you mentioned in your previous video, there is this one answer that's been known for over a decade, which is find 13, not me, which is one of the themes. So I started with that, and I knew that basically, I mean, if you know the answer, if you know the output in advance, you can start from the end of the algorithm and work backwards. So
okay, I'm just going to interrupt here because this is kind of tricky to explain. You need to understand roughly how the puzzle works. And I think I can do it using a diagram that will help you see what Alex is explaining. So the way that the book works is you have a bunch of pages, and each page has a set of verses on. You have to identify a theme that runs through all of these. There's a whole bunch of these themes. And one of the themes, which we've known about for a long time, was personal computers. And this is the example that Alex is giving here of find 13, not me. So this is a message that was identified by a guy called Jason Hood about, I don't know, 10 or so years ago. You pick out a line from each page that refers to an 80s personal computer, and you feed all of those into the computer program, and out comes an answer, which is find 13, not me. So I'm just going to explain how that works really briefly, and that will help you understand how Alex's method works. So what we do is we take all of the lines from the verses that relate to our theme, and we put them into a grid like this. So the idea is that the answer is going to consist of sort of 20 slots, if you like, and we're going to sum up all of the letters that get put into the slots. So if we take all of the verses that ended up giving us that find 13, not me message, it ends up looking like this. And you'll notice, first of all, that I don't put spaces in between the verses, so it kind of looks a bit funny, but that's just the way the program works. But we do put spaces when they occur in the verse. Now, having put all of the lines of the verses in, there's one more thing that we add in, and this is what makes Microcosm from a computer science point of view really, really clever, which is that there's a key. So we add this key in, and the key that we need for the first one is this one. And the point about this key is that, as you'll see, you can use it to make any set of lines give you any output you want just by picking the right key. This is the genius of it. Okay, so having put all of this into the grid, what we do is we add them up column-wise. So to illustrate this, I'm just going to show you the first column. So we'll get rid of all the other columns. And then what we'll do is we will convert each letter into a number. And it's very simple. A is 0, B is 1, C is 2, and so on. So the way I think about this is that I is the 9th letter, but we have to subtract 1 to get 8, so we put 8, and so on. And we do that for all of the letters, and then we add them up. Now, actually in the computer program, you add them up mod 26 as you go. So in other words, it sort of wraps around when it hits 26. Doesn't matter if you do it that way or if you do it the way I've just done it here. But if we add them all up, we get to 187. If we find 187 mod 26, we get 5. And the 5th letter of the alphabet, if you start from 0, is F. So the first letter of our message is F, which is correct because the message was find 13, not me. Alex's innovation came from a realization that you could also do this backwards. So in other words, you could start with 5 representing F, and you could subtract 14 and then subtract 0 and then subtract 17 and so on. If you keep doing that all the way up to the top, you should end up with 0. You can do a test here. You can say, okay, did I end up with 0? If I did, I've got a valid message. Find 13, not me is a valid message, and all of the verses that I've included along the way to get there were the correct choices. If you don't get 0, you've failed. You've not got a valid message. Okay, now, this is where it gets really, really clever, because obviously, although that idea is interesting, it's not super helpful unless you happen to already know all the answers. But what Alex realized was that given the relatively simple maths that's involved in the computer program, you actually don't need to know an entire message. So if we start out just with one word that we think might be in one of the messages, so Alex gave an example of president, you can feed that in at the bottom of the algorithm. You can try all possible combinations of verses, and you'll get all the way up to the top, And you should have zeros, not everywhere, but you'll have zeros that correspond to the word president, where you placed it in the potential output. And this won't tell you the entire output, but it will tell you the correct sequence of verses to put in. And so then when you run it forward, you'll get the entire output message. And this is almost what Alex did. The problem with the approach I've just described is that in order to do that, in order to run through all possible combinations, you have to run through billions and billions of combinations of verses, and that would take a really long time. It's not necessarily insurmountable, but still, Alex wanted to be able to run it all on his personal computer at home and do it in a reasonable period of time. So he came up with the really, really clever bit. What he realized is that you can split this in two. You can do it both forwards and backwards. So the approach he took was this. He started out running it forwards for all possible combinations of the first 7 verses. And that gave him a set of numbers. And all he did then was store all those possible sets of numbers. So you can think of this as a sort of interim solution along the way towards the final message. And he's got a whole load of those, a lot of them, but enough that he could fit into memory on his computer in a way that he could search them quickly later. So now what he has is something that tells him, if you were to run through all possible combinations of 7 forwards, here is what you would get, which means that if you were to run something backwards from the bottom up to the 7th position, and you hit one of those numbers, then you've got a valid message. So in other words, he's got a way of validating a message only having to work halfway up the tree, not the whole way. And the point of this, although it might sound as if it's doing the same amount of work, it absolutely isn't because of the way exponentials work. So what he was able to do then was take a word like president, feed it in at the bottom of the algorithm, that gets fed upwards until it gets to the middle. You see what you've got, and if that set of numbers appears in his database, bingo, you've got a valid answer. So that, in a nutshell, is Alex's method.
Yeah, it soon occurred to me that you could do the search backwards and forwards at the same time. You know, so if there are 16 lines on each page and you've got to choose 14, you're looking at 16 to the power of 14, which is a huge number. But if you only do that to the halfway point, if you just focus on the first 7 pages and you choose one of 16 lines for each of the first 7 pages, then there are only 16 to the power of 7 combinations, reasonable number to deal with. And then if you start from the end and work backwards as well, then again, you only do 16 to the power of 7 combinations. So in total, you're checking 2 times 16 to the power of 7 combinations. There's a few subtleties as well, but that was the basic principle. And then, of course, once you get to the halfway point, approaching from both ends, you need some way to do a very fast comparison of your partial results at that stage. And of course, the vast majority of searches get terminated at that point. And then I thought, well, you know, what I've built there, I could turn into a kind of search algorithm where you'd give it part of the output message. And as long as you gave it enough characters from the output message to effectively sort of filter out the majority of search paths at the halfway point, then it would still work. So I started translating what I built into a kind of more general search algorithm. And the way it ended up working is you had to give it at least 7 characters of the output for it to work. 7 would run very slowly, so I never actually did that. Realistically, you'd have to give it at least 8 or 9, preferably 10 characters of the output message. And then it could do this same thing. It could search backwards and search forwards, and at the halfway point, it could just use the 10 characters or so that you'd given it to eliminate most of the search paths. What I then did is, you know, as we say, I knew from your video, George Washington was one of the themes. So I tried a bunch of things. I tried Washington, George Washington, whatever. Eventually, I tried president on that same day, the first day I'd built this. And president got a result because the output for Washington is presidential road. Obviously, president is a substring of presidential, so that works out nicely. Yeah, I got that first result. And then jewel from the earth was just me trying common bigrams. I tried and the, to the, from the, which if you include the spaces, because of course the spaces are valid characters, just about met my limit my character limit requirements. So by the end of the first day, yeah, I'd got presidential road, I got jewel from the earth. And then, you know, this was really exciting. And then I thought, actually, this is going to work. Then I had to sit down and think how I could use this, because although 10 characters is a lot less than 20 characters, it's a lot less than guessing the whole output. It's still quite a lot. I couldn't just plug in a dictionary and try all common words. It was also far too slow to do anything like that. So then I had to really sit down and strategize about how to actually solve the puzzle using this tool. By this point, I had already spent a long time looking at the book, and I had my kind of hunches about what themes there would be. I'd had hunches, like I thought for a long time Columbus was going to be a theme, which didn't work out. So I knew Omai was a theme, as you pointed out in your video before. How do King Tosh is such a giveaway, that line, that there's definitely I knew there was definitely an Omai theme, but I didn't know enough about Omai to really guess what the message would be for him. Initially, I did get that one. Eventually, I was convinced Macbeth would be a theme, because one of the lines on the first page is a council of three. A council of three actually refers to Joan of Arc. I can't even remember what the link is there, but I thought, what starts with a council of three? I mean, it's Macbeth, obviously. But no, I was wrong. It's not Macbeth, it's Joan of Arc. Returning home was one of the opening lines. I thought that would be something about the Odyssey, because that's sort of the most famous story of someone going home. I don't want to pretend it was easy. I spent a lot of time searching down rabbit holes that went nowhere. So, I mean, there was, I guess, three parts. The first part was trying to guess the themes, trying to guess what the answers might be from knowing what the theme, or having ideas about what the themes might be. The second part was then relying a bit more on the Rubaiyat to search keywords. And then the third part was, just brute forcing when I was down to the last 5 or so. And then what you realize when you have some of the messages is that each message contains one of the words from the poem at the start of the book, the excerpt from the Rubaiyat. And this tells you how to order the answers when you put them into the second half of the puzzle. The last page of the book has 5 keys, and it says 1 key for every message. For 13 messages, 5 keys, ordered by Khayyam, the author of the Rubaiyat. So, and then gives you 5 keys underneath. So what you do is you take the 13 messages from part 1, and you order by where the keyword appears in the poem, and you take the 5 keys from the last page and use the same 13 lines with the first 2 keys, and you get 2 pieces of information. The first message says, I think, Blundell Nils Plantation. Plantation written Plantn, so abbreviated. And the second line, I think, says odd lines reversed. So then you take the 13 lines again and you reverse the first one and the third one, and you feed them in again with the next 2 keys, and then you get 2 more pieces of information. So the first says state Simon Foreman, and the second says remove all vowels. So Simon Foreman, so as you will remember, the way the puzzle's supposed to work is that there's an envelope somewhere. You phone up, you give the name in the envelope, and that's how you win. And then, the other piece of information, remove all vowels. So you take the 13 lines. You have to actually take them after reversing them, then remove the vowels, and with the 5th key, you apply that to those 13. You get the final piece of information, which is Shrewsbury, England. So obviously the first thing I did was go onto Google and put in Blundell Nils Plantation, Shrewsbury, England. You don't really get any hits. So eventually what I did was I sort of thought, what would you do if you'd solved this in 1984? Obviously you'd get the phone book for Shrewsbury in England. So I did this. I made an account on a genealogy website which had scans of old phone books. I got one for the Shrewsbury district for 1983. In fact, they didn't have one for 1984, but luckily this worked. So I looked up Blundell, and I found an entry for someone called K. Blundell, who lived at Nils Plantation, which luckily is a very distinctive house name. And even in the entry, plantation had been abbreviated the same way it was in the message. So then I started trying to track down people who'd worked for the publishing company that published the book. And I eventually tracked down the person who co-wrote the book, or the people who wrote the book. That was the actual second part of the puzzle, and that was a very different kind of puzzle to the first part. But that was really I felt like a kind of private investigator.
But Microcosm doesn't just consist of textual verses. It also has these amazing, beautiful paintings, 1 per page. In a second, we'll meet the artist behind those paintings. But first, I'd always assumed that these images would be just as important for solving the puzzle as the text itself, and I wondered what Alex felt about that.
The pictures are not very helpful as clues, I would say, the pictures in the book. But there is a map on one of the pages, and there's a little character in the map just down there.
Oh, yeah.
Who you may not be able to see, but someone who's wearing something that looks like naval uniform, who has their arm pinned up like this. So I thought immediately, oh, that's Lord Nelson. Once I was into the sort of the correct mental space of thinking about historical incidents, especially from that era, kind of 1800s, 1700s maybe, I tried Lord Nelson, and one of the answers is Admiral Nelson's Rose. Actually, he's not the theme. The theme is his mistress, Lady Hamilton, who's famous in her own right. But I got that through searching for Lord Nelson.
The one real name that was clearly included in the book on the front cover and inside was Nick Mynheer's, the artist. And it turns out he's not that hard to track down, as he's still an artist. And actually, as you'll see, the work he does today is still, in some ways, somewhat similar to the work he did for Microcosm.
I'm Nicholas Mynheer, and I've spent my whole working life as an artist in various forms. Started in, I suppose, more sort of commercial art, illustration, painting on the side of racing cars and doing work for sort of pop bands and things, and some really early computer games. I've got here an illustration from, this is the very first game I did, and I don't know if you can see that. It was called, I think it was called Blobo. So it was, the early games were actually really rather dismal, and they all looked much the same. So I watched the game through, and then I had to come up with an illustration that sort of captured the idea of the game. And then I moved more into fine art, and I spent the last sort of about 35 years, certainly 30 years, working on largely commissions for churches and cathedrals, because I'm really interested in sort of Christian iconography. But it's really interesting going back and looking at some of the really early work that I did, like from Microcosm, and some of the computer game covers I did for a company called Mematech back in the, I guess it was mid 80s, early 80s perhaps. The styles changed a bit, but the elements in the compositions are the same. They're the same interest areas. And it's really interesting looking at Microcosm again and seeing the things that I still like and I still put in my paintings now.
So how did Nick get involved in Microcosm?
It's difficult to remember exactly how it came about, Microcosm, but I think I was contacted by Bob first and foremost, and I guess he'll remember this more clearly than me, and asked if I'd be interested in working on this book. And I thought it was a great idea. But all along, it was kept quite sort of mysterious, so that at no point did I really either understand how the game would work, and I was fed a number of clues which I could put into the illustrations. The illustrations are largely left to me to come up with, but I was fed these clues, and to this day, I still don't know whether they were complete red herrings. And so I duly put them in, and I put some other things in myself as well that I just thought would be fun to do. This is the artwork from, I think it's the first page.
Yeah.
And for me, this I think was almost my favorite image, and it comes off the back of that sort of the idea of Omar Khayyam, this sort of mysterious Persian mystic, mathematician. And there's a combination of all sorts of images, some of which may have been clues that I was given that I really can't remember. I remember this key thing here had a code down that was obviously important. And then there was a combination of all sorts of things, sort of an Egyptian boat of the dead on the Nile, the moon and the earth. I like the idea that the whole puzzle was about sort of going on the Concorde and traveling to the other side of the world, if you like. And then a motif that I often put in my art, and I even do this now in the stained glass windows without telling anyone, the white horse at Uffington in Oxfordshire, which is, I think, one of the best bits of design ever, probably Bronze Age or earlier. And the 7 stars I often put in my stained glasses and paintings. the Big Dipper, and then Tau sticks at the bottom on the book. And the book, I think, is probably from Honorius, the Grimoire of Honorius the Great, sort of a magical work. And there's a chalice reflecting sort of Christian iconography, and on it some Nordic runes, which I do remember researching the runes and writing something on there, but I can't for the life of me remember what it says. I'm sure somebody's researched it and found out what it says. I spent the next couple of decades worrying that people might respond to it the same as they did with Masquerade, that fabulous Kit Williams puzzle book, that people might go up there with spades and start digging up the white horse, and I'd be to blame. And what was so lovely is I was given a sort of free hand just to let my imagination run wild. And, you know, I'm sure I put in anything they told me to, but I put in a lot more beside. And I read the text, and the illustrations sort of come off the back of the respond to the text.
So it shouldn't be too much of a surprise to us then that Alex didn't find the images in Microcosm that helpful in solving it. Microcosm wouldn't have existed if it weren't for our next guest. For Microcosm, he used the pseudonym Gashtan. But in real life, he's Bob Fowke, a British writer and publisher, and along with his partner Robert, he came up with the idea of Microcosm, hired Nick to produce the artwork, wrote the text, pulled the whole thing together and got it published.
Hello, Ben. Can you hear me?
I can, yes. Can you hear me, Bob?
Yes, I can.
It is
Everything's working.
great. It's so lovely to meet you.
I'm known as Bob Fowke, and I'm really mainly a writer of children's history and science books. I used to produce a lot of science fiction paperback covers and record sleeves and that sort of thing, although I didn't illustrate Microcosm. By that time I'd moved on. I was more involved with writing and other things.
So first of all, I wanted to say thank you for producing the book in the first place. I know it was a long time ago, but it was, I mean, you could maybe tell from the video I made about it, it was such a phenomenal creation. And in some ways, you know, it absolutely beguiled me when I was a teenager and I found it, and it's just stuck in my mind for my entire adult life. But then having discovered, you know, how people went about actually solving it has made me really appreciate.
Well, yes. I mean, Alex, who has solved it recently, he's a very clever man.
Yes.
I mean, he had tracked down the phone at the back of the book, which was a real phone in a real place with a real person. He had discovered that number. I mean, he had solved the puzzle, but legitimately. The place where the phone was in the house was just up the road from where my parents lived in Shropshire. So but it wasn't my parents, because we thought that would be too close. That there might be some way that people could sort of work it out from that. So it was just some acquaintance of theirs up the road.
I wondered how Alex felt Microcosm compared to other puzzles he's attempted.
Yeah, I mean, this was the most satisfying, definitely. I really like the fact that it required a mix of methods. I mean, that's ideal. That's almost impossible to engineer from the point of view of setting a puzzle that requires a bit of kind of, you know, programming, a bit of maths, a bit of engaging with the text and actually reading the text, studying the pictures. I mean, this required all of those things, which is perfect for me. I mean, if there were other puzzles like that, then I'd do them all the time. But that's a very unique blend.
It sounds as if the way he solved it is a reflection of how it was constructed. I mean, how, you know, it's a sort of combination of poetry and art and computer, and it's all these sort of interfacing things that apparently not connected but are. And he seems to have, you know, solved it in an equally creative manner. So it's really, really good.
And our reason for having it sort of going across boundaries of academic disciplines was precisely to add to the difficulty. I mean, that was very deliberate. So, and Alex obviously had the mind to do both things. You know,
Tell me the story of how Microcosm came about.
Way back, there was a book which was very popular called Masquerade. We were slightly hanging on the coattails of that book. It seemed like a good way to produce a book that would generate a lot of interest. The original concept of combining a puzzle with the use of basic, essentially, personal computers were in the very early days. That was mine, But the structure is much more Robert's, because he's a mathematician. And then because my interests are more historical, I used to be a commercial artist. In those days, I still almost was. I used to do science fiction paperbacks and all that sort of stuff. A lot of the historical content and the sort of the detail within that structure, which really Robert had created, was mine, so or shared. So that's broadly how it came about. His style of illustration appealed. I mean, it was dead right for the book. And his brief, it was a good brief because he had a lot of latitude. So there was a lot of creative input from him, as well as weaving in those various clues and things that needed to go in, or red herrings. I think what was magical about it, and it was unanticipated by us, is a creative accident in a way. Once we'd had an idea for sort of threads which run from page to page, which are disorganized so that you can create narratives linking lines together. There was a sort of magic happened at that point, which was very sort of inspiring for us all. And obviously Nick could use that in spades for the illustration. I don't want to sound vain, but I have a big amount of historical knowledge, if you like. So I could choose themes which were mostly pretty obscure characters and some very obscure, and one or two less so. We weren't totally unkind. There are one or two, like George Washington or whatever, that you can kind of see it eventually, and each one there was just something that would stand out a little bit. One line on one page that would just might trigger some awareness in somebody very, with a lot of knowledge, historical knowledge. Yes.
Yes. The one that perhaps stands out for me in that respect is that, I don't know if you remember, there's a line, "How do King Tosh," which is what Omai said to.
Yes, which is that was one of the easy ones.
Yes, exactly. It was one of the very few that I managed to understand.
But of course, the thing changed. Of course, once Google came along, you could put these things in, and that's going to come up, isn't it?
What were your expectations? I mean, did you have a sense of this becoming a huge hit? Were you aiming for it to be a bit of a sleeper? I mean, what were you thinking?
No, we wanted it to do as well as it could do. And very soon we approached Pitman, or Longmans had just bought Pitman Publishing, I think, at that stage, and we approached them because it was beyond us, really. So they took over all the marketing side of it.
As you know, it's taken almost 40 years for somebody to solve it. It was a very clever solve.
It was.
It's a difficult puzzle. I guess you knew that it was a difficult puzzle.
Because Robert worked at the Software Institute at Oxford and knew a lot of very, very clever people, he was especially concerned that there's people out there who could get things very, very fast. So there was an element of sort of fear that it would be solved too easily. But once having produced a level of difficulty, which was extreme, I do agree, in retrospect, we couldn't really go back on that. That was that. Because what could you do? And in a way, Masquerade, he'd messed it up became impatient and gave clues quite early on. I think he felt embarrassed that no one was solving it.
Right.
And we did have the same problem. But what could we do? And then, of course, time went by, and actually, we weren't, for 20 years, never thought about it at all. It was just a thing we'd done, and we assumed it had gone away.
The difficulty was just right, I think. It was probably about a month, start to finish, of me working on this, obviously not full time, but I spent a good portion of that month thinking about this puzzle, and it was very rewarding to be that absorbed in it for a month and then finally crack it.
Now, the next two voices you'll hear are two of the only other people in the world who are really qualified to comment on how difficult Microcosm is. I'll get them to introduce themselves properly a little bit later on, but for now, let's hear what they thought about Microcosm's difficulty level.
The initial puzzle in the 80s, that was really hard. Like in fact, many orders of magnitude too hard is what I would say.
The forward solve of this, like the intended solve, was just brutal. Like I don't know how anyone could ever do that.
It took almost 40 years to solve Microcosm, so I asked Bob, was it too hard?
I've taken to writing plays as sort of hobby recently, and the plays I write are incredibly difficult. And in fact, I say to people, if you understand, only very, very clever people could possibly even start to understand them. But it doesn't actually matter. Say if you're listening to a play as an example, if you don't get it, I mean, in a way, if you got it all, the magic is gone. I mean, when you read Shakespeare, there's lots of stuff you don't get, and that adds to the charm. So I don't think it matters. It wouldn't really have mattered in a sense if this had never been solved, or only been solved for 100 years. It would look even better. We did expect someone to solve it a long time ago.
Although Nick's name was listed clearly on the front of the book, as I said earlier, Bob's name was not. And I wondered if anyone other than Alex had ever tracked him down.
And it was only really in the last 10 years that we just had the odd people tracked us down and the odd inquiry came through. But very, very few indeed. And I'm not a puzzle person myself. So I'm not part of the world of people who are, like yourself, who take interest in puzzles.
You didn't offer them any clues at that point. I guess
Well, it wouldn't be fair. I mean, the problem was it's
Yeah.
fairness. I mean, how could you do that just to one individual?
Over the years, I've probably had a few emails asking me about, because I was clearly the only person they could find that was either a real person or was still alive, and asking me about it. And I said, I'm really sorry, but I really can't help because I really don't know any of the clues myself, and never been into computers, so I had no interest in even trying to solve it.
I asked Nick how he felt when he heard that Microcosm had finally been solved after all these years.
Absolutely delighted, because I was getting to the point where I was actually thinking that maybe it's not solvable, maybe it was just too difficult, and too obscure, and so it was just so exciting to hear that the sense that somebody was on the way to solving it, and then in fact it had been solved, was just fantastic. And I'm only really sorry that Concorde isn't still around to take them off to New York or wherever it was meant to go. So I was really, really super happy when I heard that it had been, that Alex had and the American team had cracked it.
Okay, I have to confess, up until now, I haven't quite been telling you the whole story. So I've introduced you to Bob, who created Microcosm, and Nick, who illustrated it. And you've also met Alex, who was the first person to solve the entire thing. But he almost wasn't. Incredibly, on the morning of the day that Alex emailed me to let me know that he'd solved it, I heard from a group in the United States who called themselves the Microcosmonauts. And they let me know that they had solved the first 2 messages from Microcosm, and they were on their way to solving the rest. So after 38 years, it came down to a photo finish between Alex and the Microcosmonauts. So I asked Alex what he felt when he heard that someone else was close behind him.
I was not expecting it at all, because I'd looked at the I'm not a Reddit user, but I'd looked at the subreddit for the book, and I'd sort of seen that activity had declined, if anything, over the sort of, by the time I found out about it. So I didn't expect anyone to be working on it with that level of commitment. So I was very surprised. I mean, I have to say, by the time I found out, this is lucky, but by the time I found out that team existed, I'd already finished the puzzle and attempted to track down the person whose details you get at the end, and realized they were no longer alive, and instead had tracked down the creator of the book and told them that I'd finished it. So I felt that I'd kind of, whatever constitutes crossing the finishing line, I felt that I'd comfortably done that. So I felt kind of lucky, really, lucky that, if I'd started a week later, they would have probably beaten me, or if they'd started a week earlier.
I'm Mike Haverstock. I'm a software engineer, and I love treasure hunts and puzzles.
My name's Father Terry Donahue. I'm a Catholic priest, former computer programmer, and I've loved doing puzzles and treasure hunts since I was a kid. Back in, I'm not sure when it was, maybe, was it January or February? There was a treasure hunt that was run by Cow Lazars that was called the Grand Adventure, I think, as run every year. And I was working on it as a team of one, and Mike and another friend of his, who he's been working with for many treasure hunts for many years, was working on it separately. And we both kind of got stuck at around the same place in one of the stages of the hunt. And we talked to each other just over some Zoom chat, I think, anonymously almost, and thought about teaming up so that we could try to solve the hunt together. And it turns out we did. We ended up winning that treasure hunt as a team of 3.
So why did they decide to go for Microcosm?
The first moment that I heard of this, I don't even remember. I think it was your video. And then I grabbed this book off the shelf and I was like, but there's this book called Microcosm, and it seems kind of interesting especially because it's a computer programming puzzle. And that I just started taking a couple scans, and I just, took a chance and emailed it off, basically saying, you want to work on this?
We got maybe 2 or 3 days into looking at it, and we realized this is one that other people might find interesting. There's a lot of junk, a lot of it's not. And this one we could tell there's a chance it's really interesting. This one had a lot of different layers to it that different people on the team might find it interesting. I'm really big into programming and brute forcing things. That was obviously on the table for this. There were runes and like themes you could see, and some people that are into research might enjoy that. So we reached out to someone, hey, maybe you want to try to solve this going forwards, like the actual intended way. And people that are really good at organization and just stuff like that. And like it pretty much ticked all, it appeared at least at day 3 that it was going to tick all of those boxes. So we reached out to quite a few people, and a lot of them said, yeah, they wanted to take a look at it. We bought into a treasure hunt, one that cost money, and we're playing it for like an hour or 2, and we're like, no, this is no good. Like, we don't want to do this. We paid money. We're like, forget this. Is there anything else we can do? And then Father Terry's like, well, I sent you guys that one thing a while back. Let's take a look at that. We took a look at that, and we were hooked after that.
We spent hours on it that night, and then more hours the night after, and we just got consumed by it.
We were looking at the George Washington theme, and we thought, oh, we can figure this out. We never did. Not going forward. So we're like, okay, let's do some research, and we held off on like trying to really, really brute force it. Like pretty early on, I wrote a program so that we could try, multiple guesses, but it wasn't focused on efficiency. We were like, we should probably be able to just get this with some reasonable assumptions, and that didn't work. It wasn't until when I believed that, I wasn't convinced that there was even a solution, that like it would, like, there might have been a mistake or something. I eventually became convinced that we would be able to prove or disprove that there's a solution when I kept working on the brute forcing, and we got up to something like 6 billion guesses a second. And that meant that with one of our other assumptions, we could exhaustively check like a certain key in 12 hours. I'm like, okay, we can do this. We will know in 12 hours if this comes back with anything good. And it did. And that was really exciting. It was Jewel from the Earth was the message. And I looked at that. I'm like, this might be something. So I gave it to everyone. They're like, no, that's definitely something. I'm like, it might be something. I'm like, I'm having to run the numbers through my head. Like, how many different random things did we try? I looked at all the other things that looked sort of like it might have made sense. I'm like, well, this one's like on another tier.
Not only were there 4 English words with spaces between them, but it made grammatical sense. The odds of this being chance, a false positive, so to speak, are, 1 in a trillion or something. So.
And how did the Microcosmonauts feel when they heard that Alex had solved Microcosm, beating them to it by the narrowest of margins?
I was a little bit skeptical that someone had gotten all the way through it. Like, it was only 3 days, I think, from our first solve to completely done. Once we had figured out what we needed to do, it was pretty quick. And then it was kind of like a little disheartening because the moment I got the Jewel from the Earth, I posted it to the team like, hey, let's have a meeting to think about how to get these faster. And someone said, I think you're going pretty fast already. Like, there's no, I don't think you're, this is a 40-year-old hunt. You're not in like any danger or anything. And it turns out, yeah, definitely, definitely was.
Sometimes these hunts have a photo finish that's very unexpected.
I think a problem with a lot of treasure hunts is they're not puzzly enough, and I lose interest in them. So that's why this one was so cool. We almost never solve a treasure hunt without at least a little bit of backdooring, without doing something unintended. And this one was basically 100%. I mean, I don't want to say 100% unintended because like it was clear a little bit of guess and check was intended, but we did well beyond the level of guess and check that was intended on this. Basically restored my faith in old unsolved hunts. Usually my perspective is it's unsolved for a reason. It's impossible or bad or whatever. And this is the first, actually second, over a decade long hunt that I've seen now that was actually solvable. The first required the author actually ended up giving out hints, which is, I mean, usually the case. Like if it's been decades, like obviously you need hints, but this one there were no further hints and it was actually solvable, and it's really cool. Next time someone says, hey, you see this thing from 20 years ago, I might actually look into it.
I asked the Microcosmonauts if they had any final words.
Being able to actually see who the hunt creator is and extend our thanks to him for making hunts like this. I know how hard it is to create good hunts, having tried, and not the same scale, but just on a small scale, to make different puzzles and hunts myself. And it takes a creative work and a love for the kind of pure aha moment. Creating aha moments for other people is a labor of love.
Okay, this video is almost finished. Thank you for sticking with me this long. It's only fitting that we finish with the man himself, Bob Fowke. I wondered how he felt when he heard that Microcosm had finally been solved.
So then, presumably at some point, a couple of months ago or so, you got an email out of the blue from Alex.
I did.
Yeah, saying I've solved this thing.
Yeah.
How did that feel?
It was lovely because it was like revisiting my youth, quite frankly. Because this thing was published in 1984, and really, the whole thing had gone dead. We talk about it now as if it's been a living project through the time, but actually, no. After 5 years or less than that, really, it was in the past. So it was a lovely thing to have Alex contact us. I was very pleased to hear from him. Yeah. And I'm very intrigued by how he'd solved it.
So what are Bob and his partner Robert up to these days?
And I have this little company with Robert, Gashtan Publications. We first met in Paris back in the late 70s. And so on and off, not all the time. We've worked on many, many books over the years, so still going on.
I'll put a link to Bob's publishing house, Caxton, in the description below in case you're interested in their services.
I don't often get the chance to do this with, my favorite sort of artistic creations, to actually thank the person who created them.
Well, it's very flattering to be thanked. So thank you for thanking me.
So there we are. Surely the most extraordinary treasure hunt story, spanning 5 decades and yet coming down to just a matter of hours between the first and, as far as I know, only 2 groups of people to solve it. As we've heard, it was a mind-bogglingly difficult puzzle, but I think the solutions from both Alex and the Microcosmonauts show that no matter how hard the puzzle, there's almost no limit to the ingenuity people are able to muster to find solutions. If you want to know more about Microcosm, the puzzle itself, check out my video here. And if you've enjoyed this video, please do consider subscribing to my channel so you won't miss out on my future videos. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye.